as soon as you start to dig into the details, it's clear that behind the optics, actually any bonuses that Putin can pick up, he has to pay for, and often through the nose. Whether it's with China, that is increasingly becoming the dominant partner in the relationship, whether it's the North Koreans who are not just getting food and equipment, but also technology.
President Putin had hoped to showcase his leadership of an anti-Western alliance this week as he hosted world leaders at a BRICS summit in Russia. But with North Korean troops also arriving in Russia to help Putin in his war against Ukraine, how powerful is he at the moment? We speak to Russian analyst Professor Mark Galeotti, who's written about this in today's Sunday Times. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Now, we spoke last weekend about these first reports that North Korean troops could be going into Ukraine. We now understand, or certainly President Zelensky is saying, that they have joined the fighting inside Ukraine. Is that your understanding? And what do we know about who they are and how many there are?
Well, in terms of who they are, I mean, it seems to be at least 3,000. Some reports say up to 12,000 troops from one of the relatively elite North Korean army corps. That doesn't mean to say that we should think of them as kind of special forces, North Korean SAS or whatever. It just means that they're probably a bit tougher and a bit more disciplined than the average North Korean levy soldier. Where they are, well, this is the interesting question. We have the Ukrainians saying that this weekend they're already appearing on the battlefield. We haven't had any kind of independent corroboration or whatever. The Americans, for example, are being much more cautious. They're saying, as far as they're concerned, the North Koreans are still in preparatory training in the Russian Far East. But, in some ways, this is irrelevant in the sense of either they're going to be thrown into the battle or else they're going to be replacing Russian troops in some rear area security work, which frees up Russian troops for the battle. It is clear that, in fact, the North Koreans have decided to, not for free, but nonetheless to help the Russians in their struggle against Ukraine.
And clearly, there's deals done behind the scenes of what North Korea gets out of this. And I was really interested in your writing, not just about this and the deal between North Korea and Russia, but also the wider BRICS summit, of how much almost President Putin is having to give up in order to get these allies on side.
Yeah, absolutely. Because on the one hand, it looks as if a lot of things are actually going Putin's way. He has his new allies willing to actually send their troops to fight and then presumably die in Ukraine. And he's just hosted this BRICS summit in Kazan, in which he chaired, and therefore he got to stand on the podium and more or less imply that he has the sort of the majority of the world backing him. But as soon as you start to dig into the details, it's clear that behind the optics, actually any bonuses that Putin can pick up, he has to pay for, and often through the nose. Whether it's with China, that is increasingly becoming the dominant partner in the relationship, whether it's the North Koreans who are not just getting food and equipment, but also technology. And the point about technology is that it's not something that is a recurring thing. The North Koreans can keep producing and selling ammunition to the Russians, but the technology is essentially a one-shot deal. Iran has not just received payment for all the drones and missiles it's provided to Russia, but has also in many ways leveraged Russia so that it had to break its long-standing good relations with Israel and much more clearly support Hezbollah and Hamas. So I think in all of these reasons, for the short-term gain, Putin is actually having to give up something that has a much more long-term impact.
And could that potentially leave Putin vulnerable?
It does leave him vulnerable, but in some ways differentially vulnerable, in the sense of it allows him to continue his war in Ukraine that he's clearly decided is existential, for him at least, politically, maybe even actually, that he doesn't think he would survive not being able to at least claim a victory there. And to that end, he's willing to make all these deals. And what these deals do is they leave Russia much more vulnerable, whether it's in terms of Chinese economic domination, isolation from old allies and such like. But I think from Putin's point of view, he's not really thinking beyond necessarily the war, and certainly not beyond his own presidency. So I think it's more that Russia in the long term will be paying the price, whether or not Putin is around to be held accountable for it.
I was really interested in your piece in the Sunday Times, which is well worth a read, as it always is whenever you write for the Sunday Times, and that somebody with close links to the Kremlin said to you, Putin does not realise or is not willing to admit that being unhappy with the West does not make you pro-Russian, which is a really interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, and it speaks to a really important point, which is how far Putin is truly being informed as to what's going on around him. I mean, we know, for example, that his initial disastrous invasion of Ukraine was to a considerable extent based not just on his own prejudices and his own bizarre historical notions about Ukraine's status in the world, but also because people were telling him what he wanted to hear. They were saying that the Ukrainians were divided, that they would actually welcome an intervention, that there were hundreds of deep cover Russian agents ready to rise up and help and so forth. So, and likewise, how far is it that Putin truly understands that it is not that he has the support of this bloc and other leaders, and how far are they often, frankly, providing very limited support through gritted teeth? Are the people around him just simply telling him what he wants to hear once more? Because if so, because although Putin is an unpleasant but rational actor, but rational actors can still make deeply stupid decisions if it's based on misinformation about the world.
Always good to speak to you. Thank you for your time this morning. That's the Russia analyst, Professor Mark Galeotti. He has written about this in today's Sunday Times. I'm looking at his piece now on the app. If you click on the World section, it's North Korea's arrival is no triumph for Putin in Ukraine. If you've got a digital subscription, all you have to do is head to thetimes.com.
Выстрел!